All right, guys, we're going to take a look at today unfortunately, the Great Depression, which is also unfortunately timely, considering the circumstance that we're in right now. But before we do so, we want to sort of look at where we came from. In a lot of ways, the activity that we looked at previously, called the Cathedrals of Modern Commerce, where you looked at the growth of consumer culture, not just in the United States, but also around the world, this new global popular culture that's being spread, even the places like, hey, if you're looking at this one, modern China as well here. But that all unfortunately comes to an end here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and take a look at some of the causes, first of all, of the Great Depression. And in doing so, you're going to go ahead and access from our Google Classroom a video link on the Great Depression. Go ahead and watch about the first 8 minutes or so here, and answer this first review question, identifying 3 causes of the Great Depression from the first 8 minutes of the video. Please do not mention anything about the stock market crash, because that is an event, but in terms of actual causes, he's going to get into the video. So go ahead and look at that and answer question number 1. Go and pause the video here. With that, hopefully you're back, and we're going to go ahead and examine now the not just causes of the Great Depression, but more particularly the responses to the downturns of the Great Depression and other um, calamities during the early 20th century. Now, there's a number of downturns that occur in this early period here. One was that there's this constant, for many, especially the working class, that there is in some ways persecution on their end. That in the Industrial Revolution is creating this working class that is frustrating, that for them is leaving them in some of the worst places to live, to work in, and so forth. But not only them in the cities, but then also if you look around the globe as well, all the exploitation of workers and laborers that are traveling from across continents, that we looked at in a previous assignment as well. In 1914 to 1918, there is the First World War, and particularly if you're part of the losing states, Germany, for instance, and even some of the winning ones are going to struggle economically coming out of the Great War. Oftentimes, there's a period of inflation because the governments have spent so much for the war. All of a sudden, they don't spend as much, and there's a lot more money in circulation as a result of this, and not enough goods to spend, not enough employment, and there are usually a post-war economic struggle, as noted in the number of post-war recessions that occurred across the world. So if you look at this particular graph right here, here is the end of the war. So here, obviously, the Great Depression that we're going to look at here. But I mean, check this out as well here. Okay, here it's the war, and then here's that post-war period. And so people are going to respond very badly to this particular time period. So post-war recession, and as a result of this, and in addition to this, for Germany, they had to pay quite a bit of reparations according to the Treaty of Versailles, to France, Belgium, and others that um, were supposedly harmed during the war. And so that resulted in a policy of hyperinflation, whereby Germany printed all sorts of money in order to try to compensate for these payments, at least paying goods on a domestic market. And so here are these fantastic images of what people did with really worthless money as a result of the hyperinflation crisis. And what brings Germany out of the hyperinflation crisis, as it turns out, is actually American banks and American resources are going to come to the rescue of Germany in the mid 1920s. And then, of course, the one that we're going to look at, the Great Depression. So again, Great Depression is not the only one, but there are issues all across the early 20th century as global capitalism in a lot of ways becomes the way that the world conducts business. Okay? And so because of this, there are a number of factors that are going to come into play in the 1920s and 1930s. One is that European states are going to be indebted to others as a result of the Great War, Germany, France, the UK, and so forth. And much of this is going to go to, as it turns out, the United States, which is going to help out all of these countries at a certain time here. So the United States, in a lot of ways, becomes the banker of the world, and they're going to help Germany, as I noted before, help to solve the hyperinflation crisis of the 1920s. And so The result of this is that everybody is owing money to American banks. So keep that one in mind for the near future. Okay? In other states, and particularly in the Soviet Union, okay, Russia is in massive despair by 1921. Okay? The Red Army is winning the Civil War, and for the first time in human history, a socialist government has come into power in a major state. But things are not looking good. One, because of the Civil War, there's mass famine, there is massive food shortage. War also meant that there is more work that needs to be done and less to pay the workers that are there. And not only that, but there are uprisings from workers who feel like they aren't being compensated enough, and soldiers who also feel like they're not being compensated enough for the struggle, and a constant group that is still fighting in Russia. So there's still resistance either from the Poles or the Ukrainians or others as well. Okay? And so when Lenin takes over, he can't just simply implement communism and say, all right, let's get rid of private property. He doesn't do this initially because he has to deal with a famine. He has to deal with this financial crisis. And so instead, what he does is that the state is going to nationalize certain industries, what are called the commanding heights of industry. So, in other words, the most important, at least to an industrial state. So, things like major factories, steel factories, for instance, railroads, mines, those sort of things that are critically important for creating an industrial state. Lenin is going to seize, and this will become public property. Okay, so all the industrialists, they're out of the picture, and this belongs now to the state. Okay. Um, However, when it comes to agriculture, you got to feed people, and you can't shake up a system when people are starving. It would just create something much, much worse. And so, what Lenin does is that he retains land ownership for agriculture, at least for this time here. And so, a number of groups, particularly in the Ukraine, which is in some ways the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, in the southwestern part of the Soviet Union. This particular part of the Soviet Union is going to do relatively well. A lot of middle class farmers actually restore some of their farms, and they start to grow during this particular time period. There's a time for private enterprise, and not only that, but a continuation of international trade. So, in other words, it's a mixed system. There's some sort of public controls, like they're promising, but yet it's not full out. Let's go ahead and make everything public property. Nobody's going to own anything anymore. It's a bit of both because they need to transition to a socialist government. And one goal that they had was to make the Soviet Union less of an agricultural state and more of an industrial state. And so a lot of the profit that's being made and generated at this point is to try to modernize the Soviet Union to make it an industrial state. And it's seen in the process of electrification, for instance, to actually get electricity, particularly to the countryside. All this is what is called the New Economic Policy, or Lenin's NEP. And it does relatively well. So if you look at some of the pre-war numbers here in 1913 compared to the post-war numbers, there is recovery from the Civil War. There is growth in terms of cattle, pigs, a little bit less in terms of coal and iron, which you're trying to move towards. But hey, it takes quite a bit of recovery for that to actually happen. But you could make an argument there's some relative success with the new economic policy. Lenin, however, has a few strokes and he dies unexpectedly. Okay? And so when his successor, Joseph Stalin, takes over, he's able to outmaneuver some political enemies. And as a result of this, once he takes over, he's going to be much, much more heavy-handed with the key goal of trying to increase um, massively in terms of industry and heavy industry. So if we go back to the previous slide, it's this number that he's going to go after as well. And so he does this and he aims to do this by creating a series of what we call 5-year plans. So in other words, it's the supply and demand won't be dependent upon the market. He's going to plan this, and other bureaucrats are going to make the decision, and they're going to not only do this in industry, but then they're also going to do this in agriculture as well. And so here's the big shift. Okay, private property for farms is going to come to an end. And so they're going to move from individual farms. Instead, they're going to create these giant collective farms instead. They break down the walls between individual farms, create these large collectives. And not only that, but to seize the material that individual farms are creating at this point here. Okay? Such that by the cusp of the Second World War, 85% of Soviet farms will be collective, and 9% will be in these larger state farms that I briefly mentioned as well. There are many who will say, like, absolutely not, particularly the Ukrainians. Again, the middle class farmer group known as the kulaks, are going to resist collectivization, saying, this is our stuff, this is our land, this is what we're growing. And Stalin is going to use a heavy hand on it. They use the power of the state, whether it's by sending people to prison camps, mass execution, mass famine and starvation in order to try to force the Ukrainians to give up of their crops. Many really heavy-handed tools were utilized against the kulaks as a means to seize their food. But what he does is he takes this particular and the growth of agriculture as a means to invest in heavy industry. And there is, as a result of this heavy-handedness, actual real growth, particularly, and we'll get to this later on, in the 1930s, which is that big event that we're going to look at in just a little bit here. So it's mean, it's awful, but he did create some relative success in terms of agriculture and particularly non-agricultural production. So with that, just a quick contrast. Review question number 2, the difference between the Leninist economic policy versus the Stalinist policy. So go and pause the video here and answer question number 2. All right, we're back. And so you could be really heavy-handed, and you can do this if you've overthrown this previous state as a whole here. There are others who decide, look, that might be a little bit too much, but yet they're going to start to lean on more government involvement in reforming their capitalist economies. And so there's a few samples, one of which is in China, though this wasn't quite implemented as much because of a number of internal issues in China. There's still competing warlords, and others have controlled parts of China, so they didn't have full legitimacy at this point. But what Sun Yat-sen and eventually his successor Chiang Kai-shek are going to call for is land reform. Excuse me. Taxes, and gathering further taxes by eliminating landlords who have paid very little, instead giving it to peasants who can farm the land and therefore pay heavier taxes. So there's the movement to try to eliminate landlords. They're not fully successful at doing this, but to increase the amount that are being produced by individual farmers. So in other words, break up large pieces of land, giving it to peasants, and therefore you also gain some sort of political legitimacy in the process as well. This is taken even further, not just land reform, but also land redistribution as well, where these large haciendas that we talked about, so again, these large land holdings that have occurred since the Spanish colonization of New Spain. By the time we get to Mexico in the 20th century, there's the movement away from this, from haciendas to now what we call ejidos, which are collective Indian farming villages. So again, what used to be this enormous farm here, instead now it becomes broken up into different territories based on villages as such. So land redistribution, massive land redistribution, that in a lot of ways is going to give peasants land for the first time in Mexico. So all of those lower caste groups that were exploited before now have the chance, in some cases, to be able to possess their land, and some land to farm for themselves here. But it's not just land reform. There's another larger, what we call economic policy. So again, this is where now states are determining what's going to go on in the economies. And so one policy is what we call import substitution. Whereby they're going to try as best as possible to catch up with the Western states in regards to industrialization. Now, here's the thing. You can't just simply create a textile factory and expect that is going to succeed. Because why? Because there's already bigger ones, more successful ones that are out there, right? Britain and the United States have been doing this for about a century. You can't just enter into the market and expect to be successful. So what new states will try to do is to protect a new domestic industry by subsidizing them. In other words, you provide money, resources, build ports and roads that would help them to export goods, give them tax breaks like crazy. And one way you can definitely support them is to raise tariffs. In other words, an enormous tax on goods that are being imported. Okay? So let's say if Britain is the big man on the block in terms of producing textiles, you're just starting to produce your own. What you'll do is you're going to create a tariff barrier, right, a tax barrier, okay, that will prevent them from selling the goods at a lower price, because once you tax them, the prices are going to increase. Okay, and now you can, as the new producer, okay, sell your goods at a lower price than the others. People are going to buy your goods and you're going to grow and you're going to expand. At least that's the idea of setting high tariffs. Okay, and if that doesn't work, what you do is just simply eliminate the competition. And so, especially in many of these newly independent states, they're going to look at some of the industries, plantations, and others that were owned by the West. And what they're going to do is they're going to nationalize it. In other words, they're going to seize it completely. Okay. And so they're simply going to take it, saying, look, you've exploited us long enough, and we're just going to take control of this entire operation. It's ours. Thank you. See you later. Okay. The nationalization of foreign investments that exist in their territory. So, again, all that imperialism that we looked at, the economic imperialism in Latin America, new Latin American states or new regimes that take over may just simply take it from the Western imperialists. Okay. Then there are two other methods. This one, created by this man, is a lot more sinister. Ooh, we don't like you. Okay. This first method is called corporatism. And corporatism comes from the Italian word corporativismo. I think that's how you pronounce it. But basically, the idea is that and the practice of dividing society into different organizations or different corporations that are all subservient to the state. So what that means is that there is an alliance between government, business, and then sometimes even labor groups, like the creation of political parties or interest groups that are created by the government as a means to serve the state and make the civilians feel like they're a part of the government. But really, who's in control, who's in power? It's the state. Okay? A version of corporatism is what we call crony capitalism, right? Sort of this unholy alliance between big business where they use the instruments of government as a means to enrich themselves and will prop up a government no matter how authoritarian it might be or how immoral it might be as well. Okay? But this is what we call corporatism, where it doesn't look like a dictatorship. In some ways it does. Sometimes it might even look like a democracy. But really, it's this unholy alliance between governments and business together, propping one another up. And frequently, this is also done by cartels, whereby there's collusion between various economic competitors. So it might seem like there's real open competition, but really there's not. All of the big corporations have banded together. They've set some prices, make the illusion that, hey, it's capitalism, lowest price is what's going to get the business. Nope, not at all. But they've propped the prices up in a way that benefits them. So especially in Italy in the 1920s in response to the post-war crisis, and then also in the Great Depression in Germany, okay, these two methods were utilized as a means to recover from the Great Depression, okay, that the government and businesses will come into alliance with one another in what we call corporatism or the corporate state. Okay. The last one we're probably more familiar with, okay, and that would be what happens in the United States and also in Great Britain as well. And much of this idea is actually raised up by an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And what Keynes believed is that in times of crisis, it's the government that should act. So, in other words, the government should go into deficit spending. In other words, it would loan from the future and other places as a means to go ahead and increase the amount of resources for the present day. And we see this today, right, in terms of, hey, we're going to create this enormous relief package for what's going on here in 2020. And so we spend now, allow the economy to recover. And then if it does recover, then all of a sudden now, hey, jobs are restored, hey, people are buying things get better again, they're paying taxes, and now we pay off what we had utilized before. But that's the Keynesian theory to try to get out of the Great Depression. Okay? Not only that, but if you looked at the causes of the Great Depression, there is the issue in terms of a unregulated capitalism. That at some point, government needs to be able to regulate what goes on in terms of economic exchange, so that you don't have banks that completely just flop and leave investors and people who've put in their savings just completely out on a limb. And so there is new government regulation of the market through a number of bureaucratic agencies, ones like the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the Federal Housing Authority, the FHA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which built a number of dams and others in um, the upper South in the United States. So this all becomes what is known as the alphabet soup, um, because it has all these, 3, 4 letter acronyms to go along with it. Okay? And much of the spending out of the American New Deal program and others in Britain and some in France as well are these large infrastructure projects. Those of you guys who've been to Las Vegas, for instance, and you've gone to see the Hoover Dam, that would be an instance of the United States saying, look, we're going to just gather money together, and we're going to hire people to create these projects that will help us in the future, but mostly to employ people in the current day and the current time as well. And so this is the creation of a number of public service and infrastructure programs. But not only that, but for those who are unemployed, those who are of old age, this is the creation of the Social Security system for old age pension, for making sure that there's